There are cases in my casebook that I have kept from publication not because they lack interest, but because they contain truths the world is perhaps not ready to receive with the equanimity they deserve. This particular account remained locked away for years, held back by a promise made to Mycroft Holmes in the winter of 1893, and by my own reluctance to set down in ink what my reason still struggles to accept. I remember it most clearly on cold November evenings, when fog presses against the windows of Baker Street, and I find myself wondering whether some knowledge serves us better when it remains private. A quiet warning rather than a public spectacle. There was a detail in that black-edged letter, a single phrase about thresholds and invitation, that has returned to me in countless quiet moments since, carrying with it the peculiar weight of truth that cannot be comfortably dismissed. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me return to the beginning, to that grey afternoon when the letter first arrived. The fire in our sitting room at 221B Baker Street burned with particular contentment that November day, settling into its work with the steady commitment of an old friend who knows exactly what is required of it. Outside, London had wrapped itself in fog as thick as wool batting, the kind that muffled carriage wheels and made gas lamps bloom like distant moons in the gathering dusk. It was 3:30 in the afternoon, though one could hardly tell by the quality of light, which had the uncertain, apologetic character of a winter day that has given up trying to be anything other than dim. Holmes sat in his favourite chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin, in that attitude of perfect stillness that generally meant his mind was racing through some intricate problem at considerable speed. I had seen that particular quality of motionlessness before. It was the absolute calm of a spinning top, held upright by the velocity of its own rotation. The morning papers lay scattered at his feet, already exhausted of any interest they might have offered. The Times, the Telegraph, and even the penny dreadfuls had all been found wanting in the matter of engaging puzzles, and Holmes had subsided into that dangerous state of restless inactivity that generally preceded either a bout of violin, playing at unholy hours, or the taking up of some experiment involving chemicals, whose names I could neither pronounce nor wish to have explained. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps on the stairs carried their own particular vocabulary. One learned to distinguish between her tread when bringing tea, when announcing visitors, and when delivering the post. This was her post-delivery step, brisk but not hurried, and accompanied by the soft rustle of paper. She entered with a small silver tray bearing 3 letters, and the evening edition, which had arrived early. "The post, Mr. Holmes," she said, setting the tray on the side table with the practised precision of long habit. "And Mrs. Patterson from downstairs asked me to mention that if you're conducting any more experiments with sulphurous compounds, might you consider opening a window first? The smell yesterday quite put her off her lunch." Holmes stirred slightly, one eyebrow rising a fraction of an inch. "Please convey to Mrs. Patterson my profound apologies, and assure her that yesterday's work has concluded. Today's experiments will produce nothing more offensive than the scent of burning sugar." "I shall tell her you're making toffee then, shall I?" Mrs. Hudson replied with the ghost of a smile, and departed before Holmes could formulate a suitably dignified response. I reached for the letters, taking on the familiar role of private secretary that I had long since accepted as part of my duties. The first was a note from Lestrade, regarding a case of missing jewellery that appeared to have resolved itself when the lady of the house remembered she had pawned the items herself and forgotten the transaction entirely, a conclusion that required no further input from my friend. The second was an invitation to lecture at the Royal Society, which I set aside for Holmes's later consideration. The third letter was different. It was sealed with black wax, the colour of mourning or solemnity, and the paper itself had a faint black border pressed into its edges, the sort of stationery one used to acknowledge death or convey matters of grave importance. The seal itself bore an intricate design, too detailed to make out clearly in the firelight, but suggesting something old, heraldic, deliberately archaic. The handwriting on the envelope was extraordinary, precise, elegant, continental in its flourishes, executed with what must have been a very fine nib and ink of unusually deep black. It was addressed simply, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, who doubts properly, 221 B. Baker Street, London. Holmes, I said quietly, and something in my tone made him open his eyes and extend his hand without preamble. He took the letter, turning it over once, twice, holding it to the light, examining the seal with that peculiar intensity he brought to anything that caught his interest. Posted in London, though the paper is foreign, Eastern European, at a guess, the watermark is from a mill in Vienna, though the style is somewhat old-fashioned. The wax is genuine sealing wax, not the modern compound. You can smell the beeswax and resin if you attend closely. The sender either maintains old customs or wishes to create that impression. He broke the seal with one decisive motion and unfolded the letter. The paper crackled softly, as if it had been kept somewhere very dry for a very long time. I watched his face as he read, noting the slight narrowing of his eyes, the almost imperceptible tightening at the corners of his mouth that indicated genuine puzzlement rather than mere curiosity. After a long moment, he passed the letter to me without comment. The handwriting matched the envelope, beautiful, archaic, unsettlingly precise. The message was brief. Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I have followed your career with considerable interest, particularly those cases which demonstrate your admirable capacity to doubt what others accept, and to accept what others doubt. This quality, the ability to question properly, is rare enough that I feel certain you will approach the matter I propose with neither undue credulity nor reflexive dismissal. I am in the process of acquiring certain properties in your country, transactions requiring discretion and peculiar arrangements regarding the land itself. A solicitor engaged on my behalf has ceased communication at a crucial juncture. The Foreign Office has shown interest in his disappearance, though they approach the matter with predictable incompetence. I believe you would prove more useful. Consider this both invitation and commission. I offer accommodation, cooperation, and payment by any measure you name. The matter touches on old laws, older customs, and questions of property that may interest one who has studied the habits of criminals and the peculiar territory they claim as their own. You may doubt my sincerity. You may doubt my motives. You will not, I think, doubt my information. You still favour your left leg on damp mornings, Dr. Watson, from the Jezzel bullet you took at Maiwand. Not in the shoulder, as you sometimes write, but in the leg, where it troubles you still. And Mr. Holmes, the matter of the Netherlands Sumatra Company, which you solved last month, but have not yet published. The cipher involved 3 languages, not 2, and the third was medieval Hungarian. I trust these details establish my credentials. I await your response at the address below, though I suspect you are already considering the journey. Your servant in certain matters, Count Dracula, the castle, Dracula, Carpathian mountains. The fire crackled softly in the silence that followed my reading. Outside, a hansom cab rattled past, its wheels muffled by fog, and somewhere distant a church bell marked the quarter hour. "Well," I said finally, struggling to keep my voice level. "This is irregular." Holmes rose from his chair and began to pace, his hands clasped behind his back in that attitude of intense concentration I knew so well. "Irregular, yes. Also theatrical, carefully researched and disturbingly accurate. The detail about your wound is correct. You do indeed favour your left leg on damp mornings, and very few people know the true location of your injury. You maintain the shoulder fiction in your published accounts for narrative simplicity." "And this matter of the Netherlands-Sumatra Company?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Perfectly accurate. The cipher did involve medieval Hungarian, a detail I have shared with no one, not even you, Watson, as the case has not yet concluded to my satisfaction. The client requested absolute discretion." I set the letter down carefully on the table, as if it might combust spontaneously or transform into something else when unobserved. "What do you make of it?" Holmes stopped his pacing and stood before the fire, his lean profile thrown into sharp relief by the flames. "Several possibilities present themselves. First, an elaborate hoax, but to what end? The research involved would be considerable, and the payoff uncertain. Second, a genuine commission from an eccentric nobleman using theatrical flourishes to secure my attention. Possible, but the tone suggests something beyond mere eccentricity. Third," he paused, his fingers drumming lightly against his thigh. "Third, something I have not yet categorized. The name is certainly theatrical enough," I ventured. "Count Dracula. It sounds like something from a penny dreadful." "The name means dragon or devil, depending on dialect," Holmes murmured. "Wallachia and Transylvania have a long history of such appellations. Vlad Dracul, Vlad the Impaler. These are historical figures, not inventions. If our correspondent is indeed Carpathian nobility, the name is less remarkable than it appears to English ears." I moved to stand beside him, staring into the fire as if it might offer some clarity. "You cannot possibly be considering this." "Can I not?" He turned to face me, and there was something in his expression I had rarely seen. Not quite uncertainty, but rather the quality of a mind encountering a problem that refused to fit into any existing category. "A solicitor has genuinely disappeared, Watson. Mycroft mentioned something about it last week. A Foreign Office muddle, he called it, though he was uncharacteristically vague about the details. If this Count Dracula, whoever he may be, has information about that disappearance, then why not simply share it with the authorities? Perhaps because he is the authorities in his own territory. Perhaps because he prefers to deal with someone who, as he so precisely puts it, doubts properly." Holmes picked up the letter again, studying it with that fierce attention he brought to potential cases. "There is something here, Watson. Something that warrants investigation, if only to determine whether we are dealing with fraud, eccentricity, or what?" I asked quietly. He did not answer immediately. The fire shifted, sending up a small shower of sparks, and somewhere in the distance, the fog bell at the docks began its low, mournful warning. "I confess," Holmes said at last, "I do not yet know, but I find that uncertainty more compelling than any number of straightforward cases. We are being invited into a puzzle, my dear fellow. Invited specifically, personally, with credentials that suggest the puzzle maker knows us far better than any stranger should. I thought of the black-edged paper, the archaic seal, the peculiar phrasing about thresholds and territory. I thought of the Carpathian Mountains, distant and dark on the edge of civilization's comfortable map. "When do we leave?" I asked, because after all these years, I knew better than to imagine I could dissuade him. Holmes smiled then, quick and sharp as a blade. "Tomorrow evening, I think. That gives us time to make inquiries, arrange our affairs, and send word to Mycroft. If he knows more about this missing solicitor than he shared over brandy and complaints about governmental inefficiency, I should very much like to hear it before we commit ourselves to a journey of— what distance, do you think? 2,000 miles. "Near enough," I replied, already mentally cataloguing what would need to be packed. My medical bag, certainly, warm clothes for mountain travel, my service revolver, which I had learned never to leave behind when accompanying Holmes into uncertainty. He was already at his desk, pulling out writing paper, his pen moving with quick efficiency. "I shall send telegrams tonight, one to the Count accepting his commission, one to Mycroft requesting any information the Foreign Office possesses, and one to our friend Lestrade asking him to keep watch on Baker Street while we are abroad. Mrs. Hudson will need to know we shall be away for some weeks, and I must arrange for certain experiments to be suspended." I watched him work, his earlier restlessness transformed into purposeful activity, and felt the old familiar mixture of apprehension and anticipation that accompanied the beginning of our adventures. The fire continued its steady burning, London continued its fog-bound business beyond our windows, and somewhere in the Carpathian Mountains, a count whose name meant dragon or devil awaited our response to his peculiar invitation. I could not have known then how profoundly that journey would test the boundaries of what I thought possible, or how carefully I would need to choose my words when the time came to record what we found in that distant castle. But I knew, sitting there in the firelight, with Holmes's pen scratching purposefully across paper, that we were beginning something that would not fit neatly into the categories of cases I had published before. Some knowledge, as I said at the beginning, serves us better when it remains private. But the beginning of that knowledge started here, on a grey November afternoon in London, with a black-edged letter and an invitation that should never have been accepted, yet could not possibly be refused. The morning after the letter's arrival brought no improvement in London's weather. If anything, the fog had thickened overnight, achieving that peculiar density that made the city feel as though it had been wrapped in damp cotton wool and set aside until someone remembered to unwrap it again. I woke to find Holmes already dressed and vibrating with that particular quality of focused energy that meant he had been awake for hours, possibly the entire night, pursuing some line of inquiry that could not wait for the civilized hour of breakfast. "Ah, Watson," he said as I emerged from my room, still buttoning my waistcoat. "Excellent timing. I have taken the liberty of ordering breakfast for 7:30. We have 3 appointments before noon, and I should like to catch the morning train to the docks if possible." I consulted my watch. It was 10 minutes past 7. "You have been busy." "Productively so, I hope." Mycroft replied to my telegram within the hour. He wishes to see us at the Diogenes Club at 11 o'clock sharp, which suggests he knows considerably more about our missing solicitor than he initially let on. Before that, we must visit the offices of Hawkins & Co., solicitors, in Exeter. Though not Exeter itself, they maintain a London office for convenience. And if time permits, I should like to examine the records at the Port of London Authority. He spoke while sorting through various papers on his desk, creating small organized piles with the efficiency of a man conducting a complicated symphony from memory. The telegram from Mycroft lay atop one stack beside what appeared to be several pages of notes in Holmes's precise handwriting, and a copy of Lloyd's Register of Shipping marked with several slips of paper. "You have been investigating the Count's shipping arrangements," I observed, moving toward the breakfast tray that Mrs. Hudson had left covered by the fire. "Indeed, if he is genuinely purchasing property in England, there will be a paper trail, deeds, contracts, shipping manifests for any goods transported. The letter mentioned peculiar arrangements regarding the land itself, which suggests cargo beyond the typical furnishings one might expect. I have already sent inquiries to 3 shipping companies that maintain regular service between British ports and the continent." I poured coffee, noting that Holmes's cup sat cold and untouched beside his papers, a sign he had been too absorbed to remember such mundane necessities as caffeine. "And what do you hope to find?" "Confirmation or contradiction, Watson. Either this Count Dracula is exactly what he appears, an eccentric nobleman with legitimate business in England, or he is something else entirely, using the mechanisms of legitimate commerce to obscure some other purpose. The truth, as always, lies in the details that do not quite align with expectations." Mrs. Hudson arrived with fresh toast and the morning papers, taking in the scene with the resigned expression of one who has long since abandoned hope of maintaining any normal household schedule. "Will you be wanting lunch prepared, Mr. Holmes, or shall I assume you'll be dining out?" "We shall be out until evening, Mrs. Hudson, though if you could prepare something light for supper, cold meats, bread, cheese, we should be grateful. I suspect we shall return late and hungry." She nodded and withdrew, and I settled into my chair with breakfast and the papers, scanning headlines, while Holmes continued his sorting and muttering. The Times reported on parliamentary debates, a train accident in Surrey, and the usual complications of empire, nothing that seemed to intersect with mysterious counts or missing solicitors. The fog outside pressed against the windows like an uninvited guest hoping to be admitted to the warmth within. The offices of Hawkins and Commother occupied the 3rd floor of a respectable building in Cheapside, the sort of establishment that spoke of quiet competence and generations of careful service. The brass nameplate at the street entrance had been polished to a mirror brightness, and the stairs creaked with the satisfied sound of old wood that knows its worth. A clerk in neat but aging clothes greeted us in the outer office, his expression suggesting that visitors before 9 o'clock were unusual, but not entirely unprecedented. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson to see Mr. Hawkins," Holmes announced, presenting his card. "I believe he will see us regarding the matter of Mr. Jonathan Harker." The clerk's expression shifted subtly, not quite alarm, but certainly heightened attention. "Mr. Hawkins is not in this morning, sir. He has been unwell since Mr. Harker's journey. But Mr. Billington has been handling Mr. Harker's correspondence. If you will wait one moment." He disappeared through an inner door, leaving us in a waiting room decorated with the usual solicitor's fare. Dark wood panelling, leather-bound law volumes arranged with geometric precision, and a portrait of some long-dead founder whose expression suggested he had never approved of anything in his entire life and saw no reason to begin in death. Holmes examined the room with that peculiar intensity he brought to all spaces, noting details I would have overlooked entirely. The quality of dust on the higher shelves suggesting certain volumes were rarely consulted. The slight wear pattern on the carpet indicating the paths most frequently travelled. The arrangement of chairs suggesting client meetings of various levels of formality. Mr. Billington, when he appeared, proved to be a man of perhaps 50 years, with the careful manner of someone who has spent decades navigating complicated legal waters without capsizing. He invited us into a private office, closed the door with deliberate precision, and gestured to the chairs before his desk. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I confess your visit is not entirely unexpected. Mycroft Holmes sent a note yesterday suggesting you might woo. Making inquiries. The matter of Mr. Harker's journey has been troubling to all of us." "When did you last hear from him?" Holmes asked, dispensing with pleasantries in his usual fashion. Billington opened a folder on his desk, though I suspected he knew the contents by memory. His last letter arrived 6 weeks ago from Munich. Before that, regular correspondence from Budapest, Vienna, and various stops along his route to the Carpathian Mountains. He was engaged to finalize a property purchase on behalf of a foreign nobleman, Count Dracula of Transylvania. The arrangement was unusual from the outset. In what way unusual? The Count required specific properties, old houses, preferably isolated, in various parts of England. He was purchasing multiple estates, not for residence in the conventional sense, but as, how did he phrase it, places of refuge and storage. He required assurance that each property came with sufficient land, and he made peculiar inquiries about the soil composition and historical ownership. Holmes leaned forward slightly. Soil composition? Yes. He wished to know whether the land was consecrated, whether it had ever been used for burial purposes, what minerals might be present. Mr. Hawkins found it eccentric, but not impossible. Foreign buyers often have peculiar requirements based on their own customs and concerns. The compensation offered was extremely generous. "And the shipping arrangements?" Holmes asked, his voice carefully neutral. Billington hesitated, then drew out another document. "This is where matters become truly irregular. The Count arranged for multiple shipments through various companies. We have records of at least 50 large crates being transported from the Carpathian region to England. The manifests describe the contents as earth or native soil, packed with what the shipping agents described as excessive care. Wooden boxes lined with lead, sealed with wax, marked with symbols the dock workers found, unsettling. I felt a peculiar chill that had nothing to do with the morning cold. 50 crates of earth? What possible reason? Sentiment, perhaps, Billington suggested, though his tone indicated he found his own explanation unconvincing. Some wealthy individuals transport soil from their ancestral lands, particularly if relocating permanently. It is not unheard of, merely extreme in this case. Holmes accepted the document Billington offered, scanning it with rapid attention. And Mr. Harker's final communication? Brief. Excited, actually. He wrote that he had reached the castle, that the Count was courteous and the accommodations excellent, and that he expected to conclude the business within days. That was 6 weeks ago. Since then, absolute silence. We have made inquiries through every channel available: the British consulate in Budapest, the Foreign Office, local authorities in the region, and learned nothing conclusive. Some reports suggest he returned to England by a circuitous route, others that he never left the mountains. Mr. Hawkins has taken it very hard. Harker is engaged to his ward, you see, and he blames himself for sending the young man into whatever situation awaits in those mountains. Holmes folded the document carefully. I should like copies of all correspondence related to this matter: Harker's letters, the Count's instructions, the shipping manifests. Everything you can provide. Already prepared, Billington said, producing a thick envelope. Mycroft Holmes suggested you would require them. I should tell you, Mr. Holmes, that the Foreign Office has taken an interest in this case. There have been other disappearances in that region, though not of British citizens. The consulate in Budapest describes the local authorities as uncooperative and the population as deeply superstitious. It is not an easy place for rational investigation. All the more reason to approach it rationally, Holmes replied, rising. You have been most helpful, Mr. Billington. If we should learn anything of Mr. Harker's fate, you will hear from us immediately. We descended the stairs into fog that had not lifted, but merely redistributed itself more evenly across the city. Holmes walked in silence for several minutes, the envelope of documents tucked securely under his arm, his expression abstracted in the way that meant his mind was arranging and rearranging the information we had just received into various configurations of possibility. 50 crates of earth, I said finally. Holmes, what earthly, if you will pardon the expression, what purpose could that serve? None that I can presently fathom, he admitted, which troubles me considerably. Eccentric behaviour generally follows some internal logic, however obscured. A man who transports earth at great expense is either extremely sentimental, profoundly superstitious, or operating according to requirements we do not yet understand. The Count's letter suggested old laws and older customs. Perhaps there is some tradition, some belief system that mandates this behaviour. You sound almost as though you credit supernatural explanations, I said, keeping my tone light. Holmes gave me a sharp look. I credit nothing yet, Watson, but I have learned not to dismiss behaviour as meaningless, simply because its meaning is not immediately apparent. Come, we have an hour before our appointment with Mycroft, and I wish to visit the Port of London Authority. If these crates pass through British docks, someone will remember them. The Port of London Authority maintained offices near the docks themselves, substantial buildings that smelled of salt water, tar, and the accumulated commerce of empire. Holmes's inquiries, backed by a letter of introduction Mycroft had thoughtfully provided, gained us access to the shipping records, and, more valuably, to the dockmaster who had supervised the unloading of several of the Count's shipments. Thomas Fletcher proved to be a weathered man with hands like gnarled oak, and the cautious manner of someone who has spent decades ensuring that dangerous cargo does not explode, leak, or otherwise create problems on his watch. He remembered the Count's crates distinctly. Peculiar job, that was, he said, leading us through the records room where manifests were filed in endless rows of wooden cabinets. The shipping company sent word ahead, special handling required, no rough treatment, and under no circumstances were the crates to be opened for inspection. We were paid extra for the care and paid well, so naturally we took the job seriously. What made it peculiar? Holmes asked, examining a manifest that Fletcher had pulled from the files. The symbols, for one thing. Each crate was marked with what looked like crosses or religious signs. Not Christian exactly, but similar enough. And the weight was peculiar. Earth shouldn't weigh that much. Not packed in. Wooden boxes, but these were heavy as coffins full of stone. The men didn't like it. Superstitious lot, dock workers. But they've handled every sort of cargo you can imagine, and they don't spook easily. These boxes spooked them. In what way? Fletcher shifted uncomfortably. Sounds foolish in daylight, but the men swore the boxes felt cold. Not surface cold from the water, but cold from within, as though they were full of ice, and there were scratches on some of them, deep gouges in the wood that the men swore weren't there when they started handling them, as though something inside was trying to get out. I felt the hair on the back of my neck prickle slightly. Holmes, however, remained perfectly calm, making notes in his pocketbook. Where were these crates delivered? Various addresses, all of them old houses, estates outside London mostly, though one went to a property in Whitby, and another to a house in Purfleet. I have the addresses here in the records. Each delivery was supervised by a representative of the Count, different men each time, foreign, polite, but strange. They paid in gold, insisted on delivering the crates themselves to specific locations on each property, and refused all assistance once the crates left our custody. Holmes copied the addresses carefully. And the condition of the crates when they left your custody? Sealed tight as drums, every one. Whatever was inside stayed inside, though I can't say I was sorry to see them go. The whole business felt wrong somehow. Not illegal exactly, but wrong in a way I can't quite explain. Like handling something that shouldn't be moved, if you take my meaning. We thanked Fletcher for his time and emerged back into the fog, which had acquired a faintly yellowish tinge that suggested the day would never fully brighten. Holmes stood for a moment at the dock's edge, staring out at the invisible Thames, the envelope of documents in one hand and his pocketbook in the other. "Well?" I asked. "We are dealing," he said slowly, "with a man who purchases multiple properties across England, transports vast quantities of earth from his homeland at tremendous expense, marks his cargo with religious symbols, and employs representatives who unsettle experienced dockworkers. A man who knows details about our lives that should be impossible for a stranger to know, and who invites us to investigate the disappearance of a solicitor sent to finalize these very transactions. You left out the part where his name means dragon or devil," I added. "Indeed. And we have an appointment with Mycroft in 20 minutes. I suspect his information will add several more pieces to this increasingly peculiar puzzle." He checked his watch and hailed a cab, giving the Diogenes Club's address in Pall Mall. As we rattled through fog-bound streets toward our meeting, I found myself thinking of those crates, 50 sealed boxes of foreign earth delivered to isolated houses across England, marked with symbols that made hardened dockworkers uneasy. The rational part of my mind insisted there must be some reasonable explanation, some eccentric but ultimately comprehensible motive behind the Count's actions. But another part of me, the part that had learned on the battlefields of Afghanistan that the world contains horrors beyond comfortable understanding, wondered whether we were following a paper trail toward something that transcended the categories of fraud or eccentricity entirely. The cab turned into Pall Mall, and through the fog, the dignified facade of the Diogenes Club emerged like a ship materializing from mist. Mycroft awaited us within, and with him, I suspected, information that would either clarify this mystery or deepen it beyond anything we had yet imagined. The game, as Holmes liked to say, was afoot. Though what game we were playing, and by what rules, I was only beginning to understand. The journey east unfolded in stages, each carrying us further from the comfortable certainties of London and deeper into territories where the map seemed less a record of fact than a series of increasingly uncertain suggestions. We travelled under assumed names. Holmes became Sigerson, a Norwegian explorer, while I took the unremarkable identity of Dr. James Watson, a physician travelling for my health. A fiction that allowed us to observe without drawing the attention that Sherlock Holmes's name would inevitably attract. The train from London to Dover, the Channel crossing to Calais, the long rail journey through France and into Germany. These segments possessed the ordinary discomfort of extended travel, the peculiar fatigue that comes from sitting still while landscape rushes past at speeds the human body was never designed to experience. Holmes spent the hours reviewing the documents Billington had provided, making notes in his pocketbook, occasionally reading passages aloud for my consideration. Mycroft's information, shared in the hushed privacy of the Diogenes Club Strangers' Room, had added troubling dimensions to our understanding. The Foreign Office had indeed taken interest in the Count's activities, though their concern stemmed less from the disappearance of Jonathan Harker than from a broader pattern of unusual property acquisitions by Eastern European nobility. There had been other solicitors, other agents, sent to finalize various transactions in the Carpathian region. Several had returned changed, speaking of strange customs and unsettling experiences, while others had simply vanished into the mountains and the silence that seemed to gather there like snow. The local authorities are worse than useless, Mycroft had said. His considerable bulk settled into a chair that seemed designed for someone of more modest proportions. They dismiss inquiries with talk of wolves, bandits, the usual hazards of mountain travel. But there is a pattern, Sherlock, a pattern of disappearances that cluster around certain dates, certain seasons. Winter seems particularly dangerous, and all roads lead back, in one way or another, to the castle Dracula. You could have told me this when you first mentioned the case, Holmes had observed, not quite accusingly. I could have, but you would not have believed the full scope of it without conducting your own investigation first. You needed to arrive at the strangeness through evidence, not through my assertions. Now you have seen the shipping manifests, spoken with the dockmaster, traced the paper trail. Now you are ready to consider possibilities that would have seemed absurd 3 days ago. Mycroft had been right, as he usually was, about such matters. The evidence we had gathered in London created a foundation upon which stranger edifices could be built. And so we travelled east, carrying with us not certainty, but an expanding sense that we were moving towards something that did not fit comfortably into any category we had previously encountered. The change in atmosphere became noticeable as we crossed from Austria-Hungary into the Carpathian foothills. The landscape itself seemed to darken, not merely with the approach of winter, though winter was indeed approaching with the steady determination of an army that knows no force can turn it back, but with some quality harder to name. The mountains rose against the eastern horizon like the jagged spine of some vast sleeping creature, their peaks already white with snow that would not melt until spring, if then. The villages through which we passed grew smaller, more isolated, more ancient in their architecture and customs. Stone houses with thick walls and narrow windows clustered together as if seeking mutual protection against the wilderness that pressed close on all sides. Crosses appeared at crossroads, carved into ancient wood, or fashioned from iron that had rusted to the colour of dried blood. Churches stood watchful at village centres, their bells marking the hours, with a sound that seemed less celebration than warning. We stopped in a town called Bistritz, the last settlement of any size before the mountain roads became truly difficult. Holmes had arranged our route carefully. We would travel by mail coach to a town called Borgo Pass, then hire private transport for the final stage to the castle. But Bistritz offered our last opportunity to gather information from sources not yet aware of our destination, and Holmes intended to make full use of that opportunity. The inn where we took rooms was called the Golden Crown, a substantial building of stone and timber that had stood, according to the proprietor, for 300 years. The common room smelled of wood smoke, roasting meat, and the particular mustiness of old stone that has absorbed centuries of cooking, conversation, and human occupation. We dined on simple but substantial fare, stew thick with root vegetables, dark bread, sharp local cheese, while Holmes engaged the innkeeper in careful conversation, drawing out information through the translator we had hired in Vienna. A nervous young man who seemed increasingly reluctant to continue this journey, but was bound by contract and, I suspected, by need of the generous payment Holmes had offered. "Ask him what he knows of Count Dracula," Holmes instructed, after establishing a rapport through questions about local history and customs. The translator, his name was Franz, conveyed the question, in what I assumed was Romanian, though the language had shifted and blurred as we travelled east, acquiring Hungarian and Slavic influences that made it nearly unrecognizable from the textbook examples I had studied in preparation for this journey. The innkeeper's expression changed immediately. Not quite fear. These mountain people seemed too stoic for obvious displays of fear, but something close to it, a hardening of features, a careful neutrality that suggested the name itself carried weight. The conversation that followed required patient drawing out, conducted in a mixture of languages, with Franz growing more uncomfortable as he translated. The Count, we learned, was old nobility. How old, the innkeeper would not or could not say, but his family had held the castle for generations beyond counting. He was respected, feared, and carefully avoided by the local population. His business occasionally required interaction with the villages, purchases of provisions, arrangements for transportation. But these transactions were always conducted through intermediaries, and always at night. "At night?" I asked. "Never during daylight hours," Franz translated, and the innkeeper's response came with a gesture that might have been a shrug, or might have been the warding off of evil. The Count, it seemed, suffered from a condition. What condition exactly remained unclear through the layers of translation and euphemism that made daylight travel impossible for him. He conducted all business after sunset, a habit that had given rise to various local stories and superstitions. "What stories?" Holmes pressed, leaning forward with that intensity that suggested he was cataloguing every detail, every hesitation, every unspoken implication. The innkeeper spoke at length, and Franz translated with visible reluctance. Stories of travellers who had accepted the Count's hospitality and returned, changed, if they returned at all. Stories of wolves that behaved with unnatural coordination, as if directed by intelligence rather than instinct. Stories of lights seen in the castle's windows at hours when respectable people were asleep, and shadows that moved in ways shadows should not move. Superstition, Franz added quickly, as if eager to dismiss what he had just translated. These mountain people are very old-fashioned, very credulous. They believe in many things that educated men would dismiss. Perhaps, Holmes said mildly, but superstition often contains a kernel of observed truth, however distorted by fear and repetition. These people have lived in these mountains for centuries. They have developed beliefs based on some form of experience, even if that experience is now encoded in stories rather than direct testimony. I thought of the dockworkers in London, experienced men who had spooked at sealed crates. I thought of the solicitor who had not returned, and the others who had come back changed. The evidence was accumulating like snow on a mountainside, individually insignificant, collectively forming something that could bury the unwary. That night, as I lay in a bed that smelled of lavender and old wool, I heard wolves howling in the distant mountains. The sound carried clearly through the cold air, a rising and falling chorus that seemed to speak of hunger and patience and territories vast beyond human mapping. I rose and went to the window, looking out over the darkened village, where firelight glowed behind shuttered windows, and nothing moved in the streets. Holmes was awake as well. I could see the glow of his pipe from his room across the corridor. He was processing information, arranging observations into patterns, preparing himself for what awaited in the mountains. I wondered what conclusions he was reaching, what theories he was forming about a man who transported earth in sealed boxes and conducted all business after dark. The wolves called again, closer this time, and I heard the church bell toll midnight with a sound like iron speaking ancient warnings to stone. We departed Bistritz the following morning in a hired coach, driven by a local man who spoke no English, and whose expression suggested he would prefer to be anywhere else in the world. The road climbed steadily into the mountains, winding through forests of pine and fir so dense that daylight barely penetrated to the forest floor. Snow began to fall around, midday, not the gentle Christmas card snow of England, but hard, driving flakes that stung exposed skin and reduced visibility to mere yards. Franz, our translator, had become increasingly agitated as we climbed. He spoke little, hunched into his coat, occasionally muttering what might have been prayers. When we stopped to rest the horses at a tiny village, barely a dozen houses clustered around a small church, he approached Holmes with obvious distress. "Mr. Sigerson," he said, using Holmes's assumed name, "I must speak plainly. The people here, they are warning us not to continue. They say tonight is a dangerous night, that the castle is not safe, that we should wait, delay our journey." "What makes tonight particularly dangerous?" Holmes asked, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air. "It is the eve of St. Andrew's Day. They say that on this night all evil things have full power. They are offering us garlic wreaths, crucifixes." He gestured helplessly at an old woman who had approached our coach bearing exactly such items, Her lined face creased with concern, and what looked like resignation, as if she already knew we would not heed her warnings. Holmes accepted the offerings with grave courtesy, thanking the woman through Franz's translation. But he showed no intention of delaying our journey. "We have come too far to turn back on the basis of local superstition," he said quietly. "However, I would not dismiss their concern entirely. These people have survived in these mountains for generations. If they fear this particular night, there is likely some basis in experience for that fear. Wolves, more active during certain seasons, perhaps, or weather conditions that create particular dangers." The old woman spoke again, urgently, her hands gripping Holmes's arm with surprising strength. Franz translated haltingly. "She says the Count knows you are coming. She says he has sent word ahead, that his coach will meet you at the Borgo Pass. She begs you not to accept his transportation, not to enter the castle after sunset." "Tell her we appreciate her concern," Holmes said gently. "Tell her we will be cautious." But caution, I thought as we continued our climb into the deepening mountains, might prove insufficient against whatever awaited us. The forest pressed close on either side of the narrow road. The snow fell with increasing determination, and somewhere ahead, in the gathering darkness, a castle waited with its secrets and its master, who conducted all business after sunset. The wolves began calling again as afternoon faded toward evening. They seemed to pace our coach, invisible in the forest depths, their voices rising and falling in patterns that sounded almost like language, like some ancient conversation being conducted in parallel to our own journey. Franz was praying openly now, his lips moving in whispered Latin, his hands clutching the crucifix the old woman had given him. Our driver urged the horses forward with increasing urgency, clearly anxious to reach the Borgo Pass before full darkness fell. Holmes sat quietly, observing everything, his sharp features composed, but alert. I saw him note the scratch marks on trees we passed, deep gouges too high and too regular to be from any ordinary animal. I saw him observe the way the snow seemed to fall differently near certain sections of forest, as if the air itself had different qualities in different places. He was cataloguing, measuring, preparing his mind for whatever evidence awaited examination. We reached the Borgo Pass as the last light faded from the sky. It was a desolate place, a high saddle between peaks where the wind howled with particular fury, and the snow had drifted into shapes that resembled crouching figures. Our driver stopped the coach, gesturing urgently toward a dark shape that resolved itself into another vehicle. A closed carriage, drawn by 4 black horses, driven by a tall figure whose face was invisible in the darkness and falling snow. "The Count's coach," Franz whispered. "He said it would be here." Holmes stepped down from our hired vehicle, and I followed, my medical bag in one hand and my walking stick in the other. The stick that concealed a sword blade, a gift from an Afghan campaign that had proved useful in several previous adventures. The Count's driver sat motionless as we transferred our luggage, as silent as a statue, making no effort to assist or to speak. The horses stood perfectly still despite the wind and snow, which seemed unnatural in itself. Horses should shift, fidget, react to such conditions. Our original driver departed with unseemly haste the moment our luggage was transferred, disappearing back down the mountain road without even waiting for payment. Franz stood beside the Count's coach, clearly torn between his contract to accompany us and his overwhelming desire to flee. Holmes resolved the matter by paying him the full agreed sum, plus a generous addition. "Return to Bistritz," he said, quietly. "You have fulfilled your obligation. What we do now, we do by choice." Franz needed no further encouragement. He hurried after our departing coach, half running through the snow, and within moments had vanished into the gathering darkness. We were alone with the silent driver and his impossibly still horses, the mountains rising dark on all sides, the wolves calling from the forests below. Holmes climbed into the coach, and I followed, settling onto seats that proved surprisingly comfortable, upholstered in what felt like velvet despite the cold. The driver spoke no word, gave no signal that I could detect. Yet the horses began to move, smoothly, steadily, following a road that seemed barely visible in the snow and darkness. The coach was enclosed, its windows offering only limited views of the passing landscape. But what I could see suggested we were climbing still higher, following a track that wound along precipitous slopes where a misstep would mean a fall of hundreds of feet. Holmes sat quietly, his hands folded, his expression abstracted. "Remarkable," he murmured. "The driver has made no use of lantern or torch, yet the horses navigate this difficult road with perfect confidence. Either they know the way by long practice, or they possess some faculty of night vision far superior to ordinary horses. Or they are guided by something we cannot perceive," I suggested, only half joking. He gave me a sharp look, but didn't dismiss the suggestion. "Let us observe carefully and draw conclusions only from evidence, Watson. We are entering unknown territory, and our assumptions about what is possible may require adjustment." The wolves called again, much closer now, and through the coach window I caught glimpses of grey shapes moving parallel to our route, not pursuing exactly, but accompanying, as an honour guard might accompany royalty. The horses did not react with fear, which seemed perhaps the most unnatural detail in a journey rapidly accumulating. Unnatural details. We climbed for what might have been an hour, perhaps more. Time became difficult to measure in the darkness and monotonous rocking of the coach. Then, gradually, the road began to level, and ahead, barely visible against the dark sky, I saw the silhouette of towers and battlements, the massive outline of a castle that seemed to have grown from the mountain itself rather than been built upon it. The castle Dracula. We had arrived. The coach rolled through a great archway into a courtyard surrounded on all sides by high stone walls. The driver descended from his seat and opened the coach door with a movement that suggested ceremony rather than simple service. No word was spoken, no welcome offered. The silence was absolute, except for the wind that moaned around the ancient stones and the distant calling of wolves that seemed to have followed us to this threshold. Holmes stepped down, and I followed, both of us standing in the snow-dusted courtyard, while the driver took our luggage and carried it toward a massive door of age-darkened oak bound with iron. The door opened before he reached it, swinging wide to reveal a corridor lit by candles, and the figure of a tall man silhouetted against that light. "Mr. Sigerson, Dr. Watson," a voice called, cultured, precise, with an accent that was neither quite German nor quite Slavic, but something older, something that had been speaking English since before English was spoken in England. "Welcome to Castle Dracula. I am delighted you have accepted my invitation. Please, Enter freely and of your own will. Something in that phrase, of your own will, carried emphasis that seemed significant, though I could not immediately determine why. Holmes glanced at me, and I saw in his eyes a reflection of my own uncertainty. We had come too far to turn back now, though every instinct I possessed whispered that crossing this threshold was a decision that could not be easily undone. Yet we had come seeking answers, and answers awaited beyond that door. Holmes stepped forward, and I followed, and together we crossed from the snow-swept courtyard into the warm, candle-lit interior of the castle, where Count Dracula awaited, with his courtesy and his secrets, and whatever truth lay hidden in these ancient stones. The door closed behind us, with the sound of iron bars sliding into place. The investigation, as Holmes would say, had begun in earnest. The corridor into which we had stepped possessed that particular quality of age that goes beyond mere centuries. It was a space that had witnessed the turning of epochs, the rise and fall of empires, the slow accumulation of history measured not in years, but in the wearing down of stone by countless footsteps. The walls were thick enough to muffle the wind that howled outside, yet somehow the cold remained, not the sharp cold of winter air, but something deeper, as if the stones themselves had never truly warmed since they were first set in place. Our host stood in the candlelight, and I had my first clear view of Count Dracula. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet or slightly more, and thin, though his thinness suggested strength rather than weakness, like a rapier blade that appears delicate until one considers its purpose. His face was aquiline, strongly marked, with a high bridge to the nose and peculiarly arched nostrils that gave his profile something of the predatory bird about it. His eyebrows were massive and bushy, nearly meeting over the nose, and his hair, though white as mountain snow, was thick and grew profusely from a peak that suggested the same vitality at whatever advanced age he had achieved. He was dressed in black from head to foot, without a single speck of colour anywhere about him, the old-fashioned style of continental nobility, perfectly maintained, but belonging to a fashion perhaps 50 years out of date. "Gentlemen," he said, stepping forward with a grace that seemed at odds with his apparent age, "you have had a cold and perilous journey. Please come to the fire, warm yourselves, take refreshment. We shall have ample time for business discussions after you have recovered from your travels." His English was excellent, though marked by that curious accent I had noted before, something that suggested language learned centuries ago and preserved unchanged while English itself evolved. He gestured toward an arched doorway, and we followed him through a series of corridors that seemed to wind through the castle's interior like the passages of some vast stone labyrinth. Holmes walked with his usual alert attention, noting everything: the quality of the stone, the placement of candles, the fact that our footsteps echoed while the Count's seemed to make no sound at all, a detail I attributed to the soft carpet of dust that covered much of the floor. Our luggage, I noted, had vanished, presumably carried by the silent driver to whatever rooms we would occupy. We emerged into a large chamber that might once have served as a great hall. A fire burned in an enormous fireplace, the flames casting dancing shadows across walls hung with faded tapestries depicting scenes of battle and conquest. A table near the fire had been laid with supper, cold meats, bread, cheese, wine, fruit, arranged with care on plates that bore the tarnish of great age, but were nonetheless clean and serviceable. "Please eat," the Count said, gesturing to the chairs. "I regret I cannot join you. I have already dined, and my constitution does not permit the pleasures of ordinary meals at this hour. But I shall sit with you, keep you company, discuss the matters that have brought you so far from London's comforts." Holmes settled into a chair with apparent ease, though I knew him well enough to recognize the quality of attention he brought to every detail of our surroundings. I took the seat beside him, suddenly aware of genuine hunger. We had eaten nothing since our hasty breakfast in Bistritz, and the mountain journey had consumed both energy and nervous tension. The food proved excellent. The meat was cold but well prepared, the bread dense and satisfying in the way of mountain provisions meant to sustain hard physical labour, the cheese sharp and complex. The wine was extraordinary, a deep red that seemed to carry centuries of patient aging in its subtle flavours. Only as I ate did I notice that the Count had not touched anything on the table, had not even poured himself wine, but sat with his hands folded, watching us with an expression of polite interest that somehow never quite became a smile. "You received my letter," he said after we'd eaten enough to take the edge from our hunger. "And you came, despite what must have seemed considerable irregularity in my invitation. I am gratified, Mr. Holmes, or should I say, Mr. Sigerson. I understand the value of discretion, and I appreciate your caution in travelling under an assumed name. But here, in this place, such precautions are unnecessary. I know exactly who you are, and I invited you precisely because of that knowledge." Holmes set down his wineglass with careful precision. "Your letter demonstrated remarkable familiarity with details of my work and my life. I should be interested to know how you acquired such specific information." "Knowledge," the Count said softly, "accumulates over time. I have made it my business to understand the world I intend to enter more fully. Your England, with its laws and customs, and its remarkable men who serve as guardians of order. You, Mr. Holmes, represent a particularly interesting example. You are a man who sees what others overlook, who questions what others accept. You doubt properly, as I wrote. This quality makes you uniquely suited to understand what I am about to explain." "The matter of the missing solicitor," Holmes prompted. "Jonathan Harker." The Count's expression shifted subtly. Not quite regret, but something adjacent to it. "Mr. Harker proved unsuitable for the work I required. He came with certain expectations about the world and its rules, and when confronted with evidence that challenged those expectations, he responded poorly. Fear made him careless, and carelessness in these mountains is dangerous. He survived his time here, I am pleased to report, though he departed in some haste and distress. I believe he has returned to England by his own route, though I have not followed his subsequent movements." "The Foreign Office suggests he has not been heard from," I interjected, unable to remain silent. "Then perhaps he chooses silence," the Count replied, turning his attention to me with a focus that was oddly disconcerting. "Perhaps he encountered truths he prefers not to speak aloud. This happens, Dr. Watson, particularly to men who witness things that contradict their understanding of what is possible. You, I think, have seen enough of the world's darkness in your military service to understand that reality is broader and stranger than comfortable society acknowledges." He rose from his seat with fluid grace and moved to the fire, standing with his back to the flames so that his face fell into shadow, and only his silhouette remained visible. A tall, thin figure that seemed to merge with the darkness of the room beyond the firelight's reach. "I have invited you here," he continued, "because I require assistance of a particular kind. My business in England is legitimate. Property purchases, investments, the establishment of residences where I might stay when my affairs require presence in your country. But my methods, my requirements, my very nature is such that ordinary legal representatives find themselves disturbed by truths they encounter. I need someone who can observe without flinching, who can accept evidence without allowing fear to cloud judgment. I believe you are such men." Holmes leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, in that characteristic attitude of concentration. "You speak in abstractions, Count. You reference truths and nature and requirements, yet you offer no concrete information. If you wish our assistance, you must be more specific about what you require and why." Directness. Excellent. The Count moved from the fire, pacing slowly around the perimeter of the room, his movements carrying an odd quality, graceful, yet somehow not quite human in their precision, like a cat moving through familiar territory. "Very well, Mr. Holmes, I shall be direct. I am purchasing properties in England because I intend to relocate certain aspects of my existence to your country. This requires specific arrangements: houses with sufficient land, isolation from neighbors, locations where I might come and go without attracting undue attention. It also requires the transportation of earth from my homeland, earth in which I must rest during hours of daylight." "A medical condition?" I asked, my physician's training prompting the question. "Some. Sensitivity to sunlight. There are documented cases of such afflictions." "Not precisely medical," the Count interrupted, and there was something in his tone that suggested amusement at my attempt to categorize him within familiar frameworks. "Though your instinct to seek rational explanation is admirable, Dr. Watson, let us say rather that I operate according to certain requirements that are not yet understood by modern science. I must rest in earth native to my homeland. I cannot easily cross running water. I am bound by rules of invitation and threshold. These are not superstitions, gentlemen. They are observable facts about my existence, as consistent and reliable as any law of physics, though their mechanisms remain obscure, even to me." Holmes had gone very still, that absolute stillness that indicated his mind was working at tremendous speed, arranging and rearranging this information into various configurations. "You are describing constraints that appear in folklore about—" He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "Certain legendary creatures. Vampires, to use the vulgar term." The Count smiled then, the first genuine expression I had seen cross his features, and I noticed for the first time the peculiar sharpness of his canine teeth, longer and more pronounced than ordinary human dentition. "Ah, you say it plainly. I had expected more circumlocution, more reluctance to voice the conclusion your evidence suggests. Yes, Mr. Holmes, I am what your folklore calls vampire, what my people call Nosferatu, what various cultures have named in various ways across the centuries. I am a predator, operating according to rules that appear supernatural, but are merely natural laws you do not yet understand." I felt the room tilt slightly, that vertiginous sensation that accompanies moments when reality shifts beneath one's feet. My hand moved instinctively toward my coat pocket, where my revolver rested, though some part of my mind recognized the absurdity. What good were bullets against something that should not exist? Holmes, remarkably, appeared more intrigued than alarmed. You acknowledge this openly. Why? Because, the Count said, resuming his seat with that unsettling grace, I wish to propose a transaction based on honesty rather than deception. I could have continued to obscure my nature, could have maintained the pretense of mere eccentricity. But you would have discovered the truth regardless. Your methods are too thorough, your mind too penetrating. Better to acknowledge reality from the outset and discuss how we might reach an understanding mutually beneficial. You wish to relocate to England, Holmes said slowly, his tone carefully neutral. You wish to establish hunting grounds, I presume, in various locations across my country, and you expect me to assist in this endeavour. I wish to exist in England, the Count corrected. Exist, not merely hunt. I am weary of these mountains, Dr. Watson, weary of isolation, of the narrow territories and limited possibilities they offer. I am ancient, older than any institution in your country, save perhaps the land itself, and I wish to spend what remains of my existence in a place of culture, learning, civilization. Your London offers libraries, theatres, society, the accumulated knowledge of empire. These things interest me far more than the simple predation you imagine. Yet you must feed, I said, finding my voice despite the surreal quality of this conversation. You are describing yourself as a predator. Predators require prey. I require blood, yes, a fact I do not deny or apologize for. The wolf does not apologize to the sheep, nor should I apologize for the requirements of my existence. But I am not mindless in my feeding, Dr. Watson. I can exercise control, discrimination, restraint. I can take what I need without killing, can move through your society leaving no more trace than influenza or anemia, conditions your medical establishment already recognizes and treats. I have existed for centuries without attracting the attention your folklore suggests I should attract. I am careful, selective, conscious always of the need to remain undetected. Holmes rose from his chair and moved to examine one of the tapestries on the wall, a battle scene showing armoured knights and what appeared to be Turkish warriors engaged in fierce combat. You fought the Ottoman expansion, he observed, studying the details. These tapestries commemorate actual battles, not artistic fancy. The armour designs suggest the 15th century. Were you present at these engagements? I led them, the Count said simply. I was voivode of Wallachia, defender of Christendom against the Turkish tide. I gave my life in that service, quite literally gave my life, in ways that transformed me into what I am now. The details are unpleasant, and, I suspect, irrelevant to your present inquiry. What matters is that I have existed in this form several centuries, and I have learned much in that time about both the possibilities and limitations of my condition. And now you wish to expand your territory, Holmes said, turning from the tapestry. You wish to move from these isolated mountains into one of the world's great cities, where millions live in close proximity. You must understand why this proposal troubles me. I understand perfectly. You are wondering whether I can be trusted, whether my promises of restraint are genuine, whether allowing me to establish myself in England would be an act of responsible investigation or catastrophic negligence. The Count leaned forward, his dark eyes catching the firelight, in a way that made them seem to glow from within. This is why I invited you specifically, Mr. Holmes. You are a man who deals in evidence, not supposition. You have seen my shipping manifests, examined my property purchases, traced my careful preparations. Do these suggest recklessness, random violence? Or do they suggest a creature of considerable intelligence, planning meticulously for a complex undertaking? They suggest planning, Holmes admitted. But planning toward what end? You have purchased multiple properties, transported vast quantities of earth, established what appear to be safe houses across England. This suggests not casual residence, but rather a strategic network. The behavior of someone preparing for either extended campaign or eventual flight, should circumstances require it. Precisely. The Count's expression brightened with what appeared to be genuine pleasure. You see it exactly. I am preparing for survival in a foreign territory, establishing multiple refuges, because experience has taught me that flexibility and redundancy are essential to long-term existence. I do not know how England will receive me, whether my presence will eventually attract attention despite my caution. So I prepare for various contingencies, exactly as any sensible strategist would do when entering unknown territory. The fire crackled, sending up a shower of sparks, and somewhere in the depths of the castle I heard a sound like stone settling, or perhaps like footsteps in distant corridors. The wind outside had risen, moaning around the ancient walls with a voice that sounded almost articulate, almost like speech in some language never meant for human ears. Holmes returned to his chair, but did not sit. Instead, he stood behind it, his hands resting on its high back, his expression thoughtful. You have been remarkably forthcoming, Count. Suspiciously forthcoming, one might say. Why reveal so much? Why not maintain the pretense of ordinary nobility, complete the property transactions through conventional means, and simply disappear into London's vastness? Because I require your cooperation, not merely your non-interference. I need someone who understands my nature to serve as, shall we say, liaison between myself and those few officials in your government who must be aware of my presence. Your brother Mycroft, for instance. I believe he serves in some capacity related to intelligence and foreign affairs. A man like that must be apprised of my existence, but he must also be assured that I pose no threat to British interests. You can provide that assurance, Mr. Holmes. You can observe me, study my methods, satisfy yourself that I am what I claim. A predator, yes, but a controlled and controllable one, no more dangerous to your society than any other foreign nobleman taking up residence in England. And if I refuse? Holmes asked quietly. If I determine that your presence in England poses unacceptable risk? The Count's expression did not change, but something in the quality of his stillness suggested dangerous depths beneath the courteous surface. Then you would attempt to stop me, I suppose, and we would discover whether the detective or the predator proved more formidable. I should prefer to avoid that discovery, Mr. Holmes. I have not survived centuries by making unnecessary enemies, particularly not enemies of your caliber. But neither will I abandon my plans because of resistance. I have already invested considerable resources in this relocation. The properties are purchased, the earth is transported, the arrangements are made. I will establish myself in England, with or without your cooperation. The question is whether I do so as a known entity operating under observation, or as a hidden threat working to avoid detection. The implications of that statement settled over the room like the dust that covered these ancient stones. We were being given a choice, yes, but it was the choice between collaboration and conflict, between becoming complicit in the Count's plans or attempting to thwart them with uncertain chances of success. I looked at Holmes, trying to read his expression, trying to understand what calculations were occurring behind those sharp grey eyes. He stood perfectly still, his gaze fixed on our host, and the silence stretched between them like a wire drawn tight enough to sing. "I require time to consider," Holmes said finally. "Time to observe, to gather evidence, to satisfy myself regarding the accuracy of your self-assessment. You claim control, discretion, minimal impact. These are claims that require verification through observation before any reasonable person could accept them as fact. Naturally, I would not expect otherwise." The Count rose, moving toward the doorway through which we had entered. "You will remain here as my guests. You will have access to the castle, to my records, to whatever evidence you require to reach your conclusions. I ask only that you respect certain boundaries. There are rooms I keep locked for reasons of privacy, and hours during which I am unavailable for conversation. Sunrise to sunset, specifically, but during the night hours, I am at your disposal." He paused at the doorway, turning back to face us with that strange, archaic courtesy that seemed less performance than genuine cultural artifact from an earlier age. "One more thing, gentlemen. There are wolves in these mountains, true wolves, natural predators, not metaphorical ones. They are accustomed to my presence and do not trouble me, but they might prove dangerous to guests who wander carelessly. I suggest remaining within the castle walls after dark, for your own safety." With that, he departed, his footsteps fading into silence with uncanny speed, leaving us alone in the great hall with the dying fire and the weight of impossible knowledge. I sank into my chair, suddenly aware of exhaustion that went beyond mere physical fatigue. "Holmes," I said quietly, "tell me we did not just conduct a rational discussion with a vampire about his business plans." "I fear we did exactly that, Watson." He moved to the fire, stirring it back to life with a poker from the stand beside the hearth. "And now we must decide what to do with the information we have been given. Is he telling the truth? Can he be controlled? Should he be stopped? And if so, how? Surely we cannot simply allow him to establish himself in England," I protested. The risk is considerable, yes. But so is the risk of attempting to eliminate a creature who has survived centuries and demonstrates considerable intelligence and planning capability. We are not dealing with a mindless monster from folklore, Watson. We are dealing with what amounts to an ancient predator who has learned to function in human society, who understands law and property and the mechanisms of civilization. Stopping such a being would require more than silver bullets and garlic. It would require outthinking a mind that has had centuries to learn strategy and survival. He turned from the fire, his face grave in the flickering light. "We must observe carefully, Watson. We must gather evidence, understand the rules by which he operates, determine whether he is truthful about his capacity for restraint. And then, based on that evidence, we must make a decision that will affect not only ourselves, but potentially thousands of people in London and beyond." I nodded slowly. understanding the weight of responsibility he described. We had crossed the threshold into territory where ordinary moral categories seemed insufficient, where the choice between right action and expedient action had become terrifyingly unclear. The fire burned low, the wind continued its eternal conversation with the castle stones, and somewhere in the darkness beyond these walls, wolves called to each other in voices that might have been hunger or warning, or simply the sound of predators marking territory as old as these mountains themselves. We had come seeking answers. We had found them. And now we must decide what to do with knowledge that couldn't be safely ignored or easily acted upon. The investigation continued. But the case, I suspected, was far stranger than any we had encountered before. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful, and populated by dreams that blurred uncomfortably into waking thoughts. I found myself in that peculiar state where exhaustion demanded rest, but the mind refused to fully surrender consciousness, hovering instead in that grey territory between sleep and vigilance. The room to which we had been shown, a surprisingly comfortable chamber with a substantial bed, heavy curtains, and a fire that had been laid ready for lighting, felt both welcoming and oppressive, as if the stones themselves remembered centuries of occupation, and carried those memories in ways that affected the quality of the air itself. I woke properly near dawn, judging by the quality of light that seeped through the heavy curtains, a cold grey illumination that suggested winter sun struggling through mountain clouds. The fire had died to ash during the night, and the room had acquired a chill that went beyond mere temperature. I rose, dressed quickly in the frigid air, and ventured into the corridor to find Holmes. His room adjoined mine, and I discovered him not sleeping, but sitting at a small writing desk, surrounded by papers covered in his precise handwriting. He had changed from evening clothes into a worn jacket, more suitable for practical work, and the quality of concentration he brought to his notes suggested he had been at this task for several hours. "You did not sleep," I observed, closing the door behind me and moving to warm my hands at his fireplace, which still held some heat. "Sleep seemed inadvisable," he replied, without looking up from his writing. "I spent the night reviewing everything we have learned, the shipping manifests, the property records, the Count's own statements, and attempting to construct a framework that reconciles the impossible with the observable. The result is incomplete, but suggestive." He set down his pen and turned to face me, his expression carrying that peculiar intensity that indicated a mind working at the very edge of its considerable capacity. "Consider the evidence, Watson. We have a being who claims to be centuries old, who demonstrates physical capabilities beyond human norms, who operates according to constraints that appear in folklore, but which, he insists, are merely natural laws we do not yet understand. How does one investigate such a claim? The same way one investigates any claim, I suppose," I said slowly, "through observation, experiment, the gathering of evidence that either supports or contradicts the assertion." "Precisely. And so I propose we treat this case as we would any other, with methodical observation and careful analysis. The Count has invited scrutiny. Very well, let us scrutinize." He gestured to the papers before him. "I have made a list of questions that require answers. First, the matter of the earth. Why does he require soil from his homeland? What properties does this earth possess that make it essential to his existence? Second, the constraints he mentioned invitation, thresholds, running water. Are these genuine limitations or merely theatrical embellishments? Third, his claims about feeding. Can he truly exercise the control he describes, or is this wishful thinking from a predator attempting to rationalize predation? How do you propose to answer these questions? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Through direct investigation. The Count mentioned locked rooms, spaces he keeps private. I propose we examine those spaces. He sleeps during daylight hours in Earth from his homeland. Let us observe this directly, take samples of the Earth for analysis, determine whether it possesses any unusual chemical properties. He claims constraints. Let us test them systematically. The scientific method, Watson, applied to a subject that science has previously dismissed as superstition. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. You propose to observe him while he sleeps, Holmes, if he wakes and finds us. If he wakes and finds us conducting the investigation he specifically invited, what grounds would he have for complaint? He offered cooperation, access to evidence. I intend to accept that offer fully. Holmes rose, gathering some of his notes into a leather case. But I propose we begin with less intrusive observations. The castle itself will tell us much if we attend carefully. Architecture, design, the patterns of dust and wear. These things reveal how a space is used, and by whom. Come, Watson, we have several hours of daylight remaining, and I wish to make full use of them. The castle by daylight proved even more remarkable than by firelight and shadow. We explored cautiously at first, moving through corridors that seemed to wind without logical pattern, climbing stairs that appeared older than any Christian architecture I had encountered. The stones themselves were massive, fitted with a precision that suggested either extraordinary craftsmanship or simply the patient work of centuries. Many of the rooms stood empty, furniture covered with dustcloths, windows shuttered against the winter cold. But other spaces showed signs of more recent occupation. The great hall where we had dined, a library whose shelves held volumes in multiple languages, a laboratory of sorts containing equipment that looked both ancient and strangely modern. Holmes examined everything with that fierce attention he brought to crime scenes, photographing details with his mind's camera, noting anomalies and patterns. He paused longest in the library, pulling volumes from shelves and examining them with the reverence he reserved for significant evidence. "Look at this, Watson," he said, showing me a volume whose leather binding had cracked with age. A treatise on property law, English edition, dated 1887. And this, a study of London's geography and neighbourhoods, extensively annotated in the margins. The Count has been preparing for this relocation with extraordinary thoroughness. These notes suggest years of study, learning not just the language, but the culture, the legal systems, the social structures he will need to navigate. I examined the annotations, written in that same precise hand as the letter we had received, filling margins with observations about British customs, legal precedents, social expectations. "He's treating this as a military campaign," I observed, "intelligence gathering before invasion." Exactly so, which suggests either genuine commitment to success or elaborate deception designed to convince us of his sincerity. But why go to such lengths unless the commitment is genuine? Holmes replaced the volume carefully. The effort required to maintain this pretense would be extraordinary. Occam's razor suggests we should accept the simpler explanation. He genuinely intends to relocate and has prepared accordingly. We continued our exploration, finding rooms that had clearly not been entered in decades, others that showed signs of regular use. The patterns of dust told stories to Holmes's trained eye. Here, the Count walked frequently. There, no one had passed in years. We found the kitchen, long disused, its copper pots green with verdigris. We found armories holding weapons from various centuries, some still sharp enough to draw blood. We found a chapel, its altar bare of any Christian symbols, its stones arranged in patterns that suggested purposes older and darker than worship, as I understood it. And we found, eventually, a corridor whose doors were locked. Holmes examined the nearest door with great care, running his fingers along the frame, testing the lock with a piece of wire he produced from his pocket. "Modern locks," he murmured. "Not the original hardware. These have been installed recently, within the last few years. The Count is securing something he considers valuable or dangerous, or both. Holmes, we should not. On the contrary, Watson, we absolutely should. We were invited to gather evidence. This is evidence." He worked at the lock with practiced efficiency, and within moments I heard the click of tumblers yielding to his manipulation. The door opened onto stairs leading downward, carved directly into the mountain stone, descending into darkness that seemed to possess weight and substance. Holmes produced a candle from his pocket. He had come prepared and lit it with a match that flared bright in the gloom. "After you, Watson, or rather with me. I suspect this is best done with companionship." We descended carefully, the candle casting moving shadows that made the rough stone walls seem to breathe and shift. The air grew colder as we went deeper, acquiring a smell that I associated with crypts and old graves. Not decay exactly, but rather the scent of earth that had been undisturbed for a very long time, earth that had forgotten what sunlight felt like. The stairs ended in a large chamber, vaulted and ancient, containing perhaps 50 wooden boxes arranged in neat rows. The boxes were of the size and shape I had seen described in the shipping manifests, large enough to hold a man lying down, sealed with wax and marked with symbols that looked like crosses, but were subtly wrong in their proportions, as if designed by someone who had heard descriptions of Christian symbols, but never actually seen them. Holmes approached the nearest box, setting the candle on a stone ledge and examining the seal with great care. "The wax is recent," he said quietly. "These boxes have been opened and resealed within the last few weeks. The Count has been using them." He produced a knife from his pocket and carefully worked at the seal, breaking it with minimal damage. The lid lifted with a creak of old wood, and the smell of earth intensified, rich, dark, carrying hints of mineral, and something else I could not identify, something that made the hair on my neck stand upright. Inside the box, earth, dark, almost black, packed loosely enough to suggest it had been disturbed and replaced many times. Holmes reached in carefully, extracting a small sample and placing it in a glass vial he had brought for this purpose. He held the candle close, examining the soil with intense focus. "Remarkable," he breathed. "Look at the texture, Watson. It is not uniform. There are fragments of bone mixed with the earth, very old bone, worn smooth. And see here, these small dark flecks. I believe they are fragments of ancient wood, possibly coffin wood. This is not simply earth from the Count's homeland. This is earth from graves, from burial sites, mixed deliberately to create a medium that connects death to death, past to present. I felt my stomach turn slightly. He sleeps in grave earth, rests in boxes that are essentially coffins. Holmes, this is not merely eccentric, this is grotesque. It is certainly macabre, Holmes agreed, sealing the vial carefully and tucking it into his pocket. But consider what it tells us about the truth of his claims. He could have filled these boxes with any earth, yet he chose specifically to use earth from burial sites, earth that has absorbed centuries of death. This suggests his requirements are genuine, not performance. He operates according to rules we do not understand, but the rules are real and consistent. He moved among the other boxes, examining seals, noting details in his pocketbook. Some boxes appeared undisturbed since their arrival. Others showed signs of regular use, seals recently replaced, lids worn from frequent opening. Holmes counted carefully, comparing his count to the shipping manifests he had memorized. 50 boxes total, he said finally, but only perhaps a dozen show signs of recent use. The others remain sealed from transport. This suggests he rotates among them, or perhaps maintains multiple locations simultaneously, exactly as he described. These boxes are not his only resting places, but rather one set among many distributed across his new territory. We were turning to ascend the stairs when I heard it, a sound from deeper in the chamber, from shadows the candlelight could not quite reach. A rustling, like fabric moving, followed by what might have been breathing, though the rhythm was wrong, too slow and too deep for human respiration. Holmes heard it too. He raised the candle higher, and its light penetrated further into the chamber's depths, revealing additional boxes arranged in a separate section, and beyond them, hanging from the ceiling by what appeared to be leather straps. Several large shapes that I first took for bundles of cloth or stored equipment. Then one of them moved. Not with the movement of something waking, but with the small adjustment of something that was already awake, and had been watching us from the darkness, waiting to see what we would do. "Holmes," I whispered, my hand moving toward my revolver. "Bats," he said, his voice admirably steady. "Very large bats, but merely bats nonetheless. The Count mentioned wolves. It appears he also keeps other creatures, as companions, perhaps, or guards, or something else entirely." The shapes hung motionless now, but I could see them more clearly. Winged forms the size of small dogs, their faces oddly flattened, their eyes catching the candlelight with a red gleam that suggested something more than simple animal awareness. "I think," Holmes said quietly, "we have gathered sufficient evidence from this particular location. Let us return to daylight and consider what we have learned." We ascended the stairs with rather more haste than we had descended them, and I confess I felt considerable relief when Holmes locked the door behind us, though I recognized the futility of a lock against creatures that could fly, and against a host who knew every passage of his own domain. We spent the remainder of the daylight hours in Holmes's room, analyzing our findings, debating their implications. Holmes examined the earth sample under a small travelling microscope he had brought, confirming his initial observations. The soil was indeed mixed with bone fragments and organic matter from graves, creating a medium that was as much reliquary as earth. "The question," Holmes said, setting aside the microscope, "is whether these constraints are psychological or physical. Does he require this earth because of some genuine metabolic or mystical need? Or has he simply convinced himself over centuries that he requires it? creating a dependency through belief rather than biology. Does the distinction matter? I asked. If the constraint is real in practice, whether its source is physical or psychological seems academic. It matters greatly, Watson. If the constraint is physical, if his biology genuinely requires native Earth, then it represents a vulnerability that cannot be overcome through will or adaptation. But if it is psychological, or belief system he has internalized, then it might be challenged or changed. The former makes him dangerous but predictable. The latter makes him dangerous and potentially capable of evolution beyond current constraints. I poured us both tea from the pot a servant had brought. When the servant had arrived, I could not say, for I had heard no knock, seen no one enter, yet the tea had appeared on the side table as if by supernatural agency. The tea itself was excellent, hot and strongly brewed, exactly what was needed after hours of exploration in cold stone chambers. "What do you propose we do tonight?" I asked. "The Count will expect us to join him to continue our discussions. How do we proceed, given what we have discovered?" Holmes was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire that now burned cheerfully in his grate. When he spoke, his voice carried a quality I had rarely heard from him: uncertainty wrestling with conviction. The scientific mind confronting evidence that challenged its fundamental assumptions about reality. "We continue as we began, Watson. We observe, we gather evidence, we test hypotheses. But we do so with the understanding that we are dealing with something that transcends our usual categories. The Count is not human, yet he is not mindless. He is predatory, yet he claims control. He is ancient, yet he adapts and plans for the future. We must approach him as we would any complex problem, with rigor, with caution, and with the humility to acknowledge when our existing frameworks prove insufficient. And if we conclude that he poses unacceptable danger, if we determine that his presence in England would threaten innocent lives, then we must find a way to stop him," Holmes said flatly. "Though I confess I am not yet certain how one stops a creature who has survived centuries and demonstrates considerable intelligence. But that decision, that final determination, requires more evidence than we currently possess. Tonight, we dine with a vampire and continue our investigation. Tomorrow, we make our choice." The sun was setting beyond the windows, winter dusk coming early in these mountains. Soon the Count would wake, if waking was the proper term for whatever transition occurred when daylight faded and darkness claimed these ancient halls. We had learned much, but I suspected the true test still awaited us, somewhere in the hours between sunset and dawn, in conversations yet to come, and evidence yet to be gathered. The investigation continued, and with each hour the path between collaboration and confrontation grew narrower and more difficult to navigate. The Count found us in the library as full darkness settled over the castle. We had not heard him approach. His movements possessed that same unnatural silence we had noted the previous evening. But suddenly he was present, standing in the doorway with the patient stillness of something that has learned to wait with absolute immobility. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying its usual courtesy, "I trust you have found your explorations illuminating?" Holmes looked up from the volume he'd been examining, a treatise on Wallachian history, written in what I assumed was Romanian, or one of its dialect variants. His expression revealed nothing, but I knew him well enough to sense the calculation occurring beneath that composed exterior. "Most illuminating," Holmes replied. "I took the liberty of examining your storage chambers. I hope this does not constitute a breach of hospitality." "Not at all. I invited investigation. You would be failing in your duties if you accepted my claims without verification." The Count moved into the room with that fluid grace that suggested predatory efficiency rather than human movement. "What did you conclude from your observations?" "That you were truthful about your requirements. The earth in those boxes is precisely what you described. Native soil from burial sites, mixed deliberately to create a medium suited to your rest. The care with which you maintain these supplies suggests genuine dependency rather than theatrical affectation." "Very good, Mr. Holmes. And what else did you observe?" Holmes set down the volume carefully. "That you maintain more boxes than you actively use, suggesting redundancy for security. That you share your resting place with creatures I assume serve some function in your household. That the locks on those chambers are modern and well maintained, indicating you value privacy even in your own domain." The Count smiled, and I saw again those pronounced canines that seemed too sharp for ordinary human dentistry. "You see clearly, as I knew you would. Yes, the bats serve as sentinels, one might say. They are sensitive to intrusion and alert me to unexpected visitors. And yes, I maintain redundancy, because experience has taught me that survival requires multiple contingencies." He moved to the window, looking out over the darkened mountains where snow fell steadily, visible only as movement against the lesser darkness of the sky. "You have observed my constraints. Now let me explain why I offered you this access, this unusual transparency. I wish to propose a formal arrangement." Holmes and I exchanged glances. "What sort of arrangement?" Holmes asked. "I will complete my relocation to England. I will establish myself in the properties I have purchased, conduct my affairs with discretion, feed as I require, but with the restraint I have described. In exchange, you will serve as observer and occasional liaison, someone who can assure your government that I pose no threat to British interests, who can intervene should misunderstandings arise, who can help me navigate the complexities of operating in a foreign territory. You wish to formalize what amounts to supervision," Holmes said slowly. "You offer yourself for monitoring in exchange for tacit permission to exist in England." "Precisely. I am offering accountability, Mr. Holmes. I am offering to be a known entity rather than an unknown threat. This serves both our interests. You gain assurance of control. I gain security of established presence." I could remain silent no longer. "Count Dracula, you describe yourself as a predator. You acknowledge that you require blood for sustenance. How can you possibly expect us to facilitate your presence in London, knowing that innocent people will become your prey?" He turned from the window, his dark eyes fixing on me with an intensity that made it difficult to hold his gaze. "Dr. Watson, I appreciate your moral clarity. But consider, I have existed for centuries. I have fed thousands of times. If I were the mindless monster of folklore, leaving a trail of corpses wherever I went, would I have remained undetected? Would I have survived long enough to stand before you now?" "That does not answer my question," I said, though my voice carried less certainty than I wished. "Then let me answer directly. I feed. Yes. I take blood from living humans. Yes. But I do not kill unless circumstances force me to violence. and such circumstances are rare when one exercises patience and planning. I can take what I need from a sleeping victim who wakes with nothing more than unexplained fatigue and a small wound easily attributed to insect bite or minor accident. I can space my feeding carefully, never taking too much from any single individual. I can move through your society as illness moves, present but not catastrophic, affecting individuals but not threatening populations. Holmes had been watching this exchange with his characteristic attention to detail, noting not just words, but tone, posture, the subtle indicators that might suggest truth or deception. "You claim control," he said finally. "But how can we verify that claim? How can we ensure you will exercise the restraint you describe?" "By observation," the Count replied. "By the very arrangement I propose. You monitor my activities, investigate any suspicious deaths or disappearances in areas where I establish residence. If you discover evidence of excessive feeding or reckless behavior, you take action. Inform your brother, organize resistance, attempt to eliminate me if you deem it necessary. I am offering not just access, but ongoing verification of my claims." "And if we refuse your arrangement?" Holmes asked. "If we determine here and now that your presence in England is unacceptable?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. The Count's expression did not change, but something in the quality of his stillness suggested dangerous depths. "Then we discover whether the detective or the predator proves more formidable," he said softly, echoing his words from the previous evening. "I would prefer cooperation, Mr. Holmes, but I will not be denied my plans by two men, however capable. I have already invested too much, prepared too thoroughly. I will relocate to England. The only question is whether I do so with your knowledge and conditional acceptance, or whether I disappear into London's vastness and conduct my affairs without any supervision whatsoever." The choice he offered was no choice at all. Collaboration or chaos, supervision or complete loss of control. Yet, I could see in Holmes's expression that he recognized something I was only beginning to understand. We had no means to stop this creature, no weapons adequate to the task, no strategy that offered reasonable chance of success. The Count had not invited us to judge him, but rather to witness his inevitability and choose how we would respond to it. Holmes rose from his chair slowly, moving to stand near the fire, where its light cast his sharp features into dramatic relief. "I require one final test," he said, "one demonstration that your constraints are genuine and exploitable. Name it. Tomorrow night you will attempt to enter a room in this castle that I will prepare according to certain specifications. If you cannot enter, if the constraints you describe prove genuine and binding, then I will accept that you operate according to rules that can be observed, tested, and potentially enforced. If you can enter despite these constraints, then your claims of limitation are false, and we have nothing further to discuss." The Count considered this for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Agreed. Prepare your test, Mr. Holmes. I will submit to it willingly. And when I fail to cross your threshold, for I will fail, we will formalize our arrangement and you will return to London knowing that at least one predator in England operates according to rules you understand." The test Holmes devised was both simple and profound in its implications. He selected a small chamber on the castle's eastern side, one that had been used for storage and stood empty of furniture. Working through the daylight hours while the Count slept in his earth-filled coffin, Holmes prepared the room with meticulous care. He inscribed symbols at the threshold, not the garish theatrical crosses of folklore, but carefully researched protective marks from various traditions, drawing on volumes in the Count's own library. He lined the doorway with fragments of consecrated earth that I had carried from the small chapel we had discovered, earth that had been blessed by Christian ritual centuries ago. He placed running water in shallow dishes at strategic points, creating barriers of moving liquid that, according to the folklore Holmes was testing, should prove impassable to the Count's kind. And then, most significantly, he created a space to which the Count had never been invited, had never explicitly been asked to enter. If the rules of threshold and invitation were genuine, if they constituted actual constraints rather than superstitious theatre, then this room should prove impenetrable. Night fell with the swiftness of winter in these mountains. We waited in the corridor outside the prepared chamber, and precisely at sunset the Count appeared, moving through the shadows with that uncanny grace that no longer startled me, but still sent primitive warnings racing along my spine. "Your test is ready?" he asked, his tone suggesting genuine curiosity rather than challenge. "It is," Holmes replied. "I invite you to attempt entry into this room. No deception, no hidden weapons, simply an attempt to cross that threshold and stand within that space." The Count approached the doorway slowly, his movements suggesting caution born of experience rather than fear. He reached the threshold and stopped as if he had encountered a physical barrier, though nothing visible prevented his passage. His hand extended toward the empty air of the doorway, and I saw something extraordinary. His fingers stopped perhaps an inch from crossing the plane of the threshold, as if pressing against invisible glass. "Remarkable," he murmured, and there was something in his voice that might have been respect, or possibly resignation. "You have created a proper boundary, Mr. Holmes. The threshold is consecrated. The invitation is withheld. The running water creates disruption to the spaces between. I cannot enter this room unless you speak the words of welcome, unless you invite me of your own will." Holmes watched with that fierce attention he brought to crucial experiments. This is genuine constraint, then, not performance, but actual limitation. As genuine as gravity, Mr. Holmes, as genuine as any law of physics, though the mechanisms remain obscure, even to me. The Count withdrew his hand from the threshold. "I am bound by rules I did not choose and cannot fully explain. But I have learned to work within those rules, to understand their boundaries and exploit their structures. This is what makes me different from the mindless monsters of your folklore. I am conscious of my constraints and can plan accordingly." Holmes stood silent for a long moment, processing what he had witnessed. Then he spoke 3 words that changed everything. "Please come in." The Count crossed the threshold as easily as stepping through an open door. The barriers that had held him vanished the instant invitation was given, proving that the constraint was real, but also that it could be overcome through simple human cooperation, or manipulation. "Thank you for that demonstration," the Count said quietly. "You now understand both my limitation and its weakness. I cannot enter uninvited, but humans can be persuaded to offer invitation through countless means: deception, desperation, simple social courtesy. This is why I have survived centuries in a world that fears me. I do not break rules. I convince others to waive them on my behalf." We departed the castle Dracula 3 days later, carrying with us a small locked box containing a sample of the Count's native earth, proof that couldn't be shared, knowledge that served better, kept private. The journey back through the mountains felt different somehow, as if we were descending from territories where the normal rules of reality held less firmly into the comfortable certainties of the civilized world. The Count had been courteous to the end, providing letters of introduction to his London properties, sharing the schedules of his planned movements, offering what amounted to a complete intelligence briefing on his intended activities. He had made good on his promise of transparency, though I suspected this transparency served his purposes as much as ours. Holmes spent the long train journey back to England in near silence, processing what we had learned, calculating consequences and probabilities. Only as we crossed the Channel, with the white cliffs of Dover visible through morning mist, did he finally speak of what we would do with our impossible knowledge. "We tell Mycroft," he said simply. "We provide him with the facts, sanitized of supernatural elements where possible, framed in terms of foreign intelligence and unusual security concerns where necessary. We establish monitoring protocols. And then we watch. We observe whether the Count keeps his promises, whether his claimed restraint proves genuine." "And if it does not," I asked, "if we discover evidence of excessive predation?" "Then we act. We have learned the rules by which he operates. Threshold, invitation, running water, native earth. These constraints can be exploited. Barriers can be created. Sanctuaries can be established. He is dangerous, Watson, but he is not invulnerable. Knowledge is our weapon, and he has given us considerable knowledge." London welcomed us back with its familiar fog, its comfortable chaos, its millions of inhabitants going about their business unaware that something ancient and predatory had established residence among them. We returned to Baker Street, where Mrs. Hudson fussed over us, and the fire burned with prosaic cheerfulness, and the world seemed blessedly ordinary after the strangeness of Carpathian castles and conversations with creatures that should not exist. I wrote nothing of this case at the time. The truth seemed too strange for publication, too dangerous for casual revelation. Instead, I locked my notes away with Holmes's blessing, marking the file as private, to be opened only if circumstances required the knowledge it contained. Years passed. The Count established himself in England exactly as he had promised, quietly, carefully, leaving no trail of obvious victims. Mycroft's agents monitored his movements, investigated suspicious incidents in his vicinity, and found nothing conclusive. Deaths and disappearances that might have been his work, or might have been ordinary tragedy in a city where tragedy was commonplace. Holmes maintained occasional contact, a formal arrangement that amounted to supervised existence for a predator who had agreed to constraints in exchange for territory. It was not comfortable knowledge, not a solution that sat easily with moral certainty. But it was, perhaps, the best outcome possible when dealing with something that couldn't be easily destroyed and wouldn't be easily denied. I open this account now, years later, because I believe some truths should be recorded even if they cannot be widely shared. Sherlock Holmes once investigated a vampire. He learned the rules by which such creatures operate, and he made the difficult choice to supervise rather than attempt destruction, to contain rather than eliminate, to accept the lesser evil when the alternative promised only chaos. Some knowledge protects by remaining private, but some knowledge, carefully shared, might save lives should similar circumstances arise again. The locked box of Carpathian earth rests still in the vaults at Cox and Company, marked with symbols Holmes inscribed to prevent accidental opening. The Count, if he still exists, conducts his affairs in London's vastness. And I, having set these words down carefully, will return this manuscript to its locked drawer, where it will wait until wisdom determines whether the world is ready for truth that transcends comfortable categories. The case of the Carpathian Castle is closed. The investigation, in its way, continues still.